In today's tutorial, we're going to get into the holiday spirit by painting a simple and easy watercolor mistletoe with some berries and ribbon. This one is perfect for beginners or artists of any level, so grab your supplies and let's get started. As always, all of the supplies I'm using are linked down below in the description box, so be sure to check that out if you're ever wondering what paper, paint, or brushes I'm using throughout this video. Now you might notice some pencil marks on my paper. I did sketch this one out. I'll put the sketch on screen if you want to pause the video and copy it onto your paper, but this is definitely not a painting that you need a sketch for, and I'll show you each of the steps along the way, so I don't want you to feel like you have to sketch anything out. But let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we'll paint are the leaves and the stems, and if you have watched my other tutorials, you can probably guess what color we're going to use for this. I'm going to be using deep sap green, but I'm going to use some light values and some darker values to give all the leaves a little bit more contrast and just help it not look so flat. So go ahead and mix up your shade of green. You don't have to use deep sap green. Any shade that you like is perfectly fine. And I'm going to start with a very light value. So a light value again just means it's more watered down. And starting from the top, I'm going to use the tip of my brush and gently create a thin little stem straight down and then curving to the left. I will be going over this again with a darker value later on, but for now I just want to kind of block in where these main stems are going to be. So I'm going to have that coming all the way down to the bottom left. Just using the tip of my brush, so it's a very thin line like you can see. And we'll start with this very bottom leaf. I'm going to bring you in a bit closer so you can see the process better. Okay, so we have the stem going all the way down to this bottom section here, and I'm going to take that same very light watered down value of green, and I'm just going to apply a thin base layer across this entire little leaf. And I want that to be a thin, even layer. I don't want any pooling happening, but I want enough moisture there that I can add layers on top and get some beautiful blends of color. So going in with a medium value of green now, which just means it's slightly darker. I have less water in my mixture. I'm just going to take my brush and tap some of that color in along one edge of this leaf, and you can see that gentle gradient there with the darker green on top of the light first layer. And it does a lot of the blending work for us. You can see it's already a beautiful gradient, but I just want to make it even smoother. So I'm going to rinse off my brush, tap off any excess water, and then I'm just going to gently soften out some of those edges a little bit more so we get an even smoother gradient. But you can see how we have some light values of green, we have some darker values of green. If I were to make this whole leaf just one shade, it would look very flat. And so having a bit of contrast there and a bit of that transition from light to dark, that'll help the entire piece look a little bit more interesting. So let's do that same thing on this next little leaf to the left. Again, you can make your sketch however you want, or you don't even have to sketch. Like I said, you can add as many leaves, you can add more than I'm doing, you can add a few less, you can make them pointing in different directions, but the process will still be the same. We're still adding in the stems, adding in the leaves, and then the berries and the ribbon. So feel free to make it your own if you'd like, or of course, you can add your little elements in the same places I am. So once again, I'm starting with that thin, even base layer. I'm not pressing down too hard, and then using the tip of my brush to connect that to the first stem that we painted. So each of these leaves will have a little miniature stem connecting it. So I have my base layer there, and then I'll mix up a slightly darker value of green. It's the same exact green, but just slightly darker. And I gently tap that in, and then it starts to bleed on its own. So I usually tap some at the bottom, and then along one of the edges. And I want that to be even slightly darker. So I'm gonna grab a bit more color and bring that in just on the edge. So we have that beautiful gradient forming. And once again, I'll take my clean, damp brush and help smooth that out a little bit more. Now you can do as many layers as you want. I want this to be a pretty simple piece, so I'm just probably gonna do that initial layer and call it good. But if you want to really build out depth and help make it look even more realistic, you can add as many layers as you want and really bring down that color value. But like I said, even just having a little bit of variation between light and dark can help bring this painting to life. Let's move on to the next one here. I have my light green mixture. I'm applying that base layer while it's still wet. That's a key thing. You want to make sure that that first layer is still wet when you go to add in this additional layer, because that's what will help you get that wet on wet blend when you add in your darker values. So tapping some of that in, bringing in some depth, and just lining the edge of that leaf before connecting it to our main stem. Rinsing off my brush, tapping off any excess water, and then using my clean brush to smooth out any of those edges and make it look a little bit more clean. So this is what all of our leaves are going to look like, but I want you to make sure that you're varying all of them. So you can see like this one has a bit of a curve to it and it looks a little more flat. This one's slightly darker, this one's a little bit lighter. So making sure that all of your elements don't look exactly the same, that really helps make any painting really, but especially this one when we have a lot of the same elements. It makes it look more alive and natural and organic rather than having all your leaves be the exact same shape, the exact same color with no variation. So keep that in mind as you are painting this. So we have one more leaf to do on this left stem. We have 3 primary stems, one on the left, middle, and right. So we have one more on this left one. So I'm starting with the thin layer and then going in on top with a darker layer. And even this, if you're familiar with Deep Sap Green, this is still a very light value of it. Deep Sap Green, if you take the pigment straight from the tube or the palette, it is very deep, very rich, but you can really make it as light or dark as you want. So even though, yes, the second layer is darker than the first layer, it's still pretty light compared to the straight from the tube pigment. So that's what I'm saying. If I wanted to go even darker and add a million different layers, I could really pull this contrast from super light to super dark, but I don't want to do that for this piece. I want to keep it pretty simple while still having a little bit of variation. So there's our left stem. It's all done. We'll add the berries and the ribbon later, but for now I just want to block in all of the leaves and make sure I like the direction, make sure there's some good movement to the piece. So I am going to move on to the middle stem, and the middle stem is quite small. It only has 2 little leaves coming off of it, but I'll start with that light value of green again. Using the very tip of my brush, let's go up to the top, line the very tip top of that stem, and then gently, not applying too much pressure, I'm bringing that down to right about here. So this center stem is going to be slightly higher, and we're having only 2 leaves, one here and one here. So we'll do the same exact process. Start with that light layer, add in your first leaf, then I grab a darker value of my green, and let the wet on wet magic do its thing. I need to grab a little more pigment there, but I just tap it in and you can see because that layer is still wet, it starts to blend and bleed and do the work for us. You can smooth it out a bit, and when I do this, all I'm doing is making sure that there aren't any harsh lines from light to dark. I want it to be extra smooth. One thing I want to point out here is you can see that this little connecting stem is quite a bit darker than the first stem we did. That's why I mentioned at the start of this that I'll probably go back over it one more time to deepen the value of some of these stems. But for now, like I said, I really just want to block out the leaves. So that is what I'm going to do first, and then we can always go back in and darken those stems. So this leaf is going to be a little bit bigger, but the same exact process. Starting light and adding in my color. So now we have our left stem, we have our middle stem. Let's do the last one, which will be the very right side. Starting again with the tip of my brush. I add that first top section and then I pull it down, and this one's going to be the longest. I need a little more color in my brush, but this one's the longest, so I'm pulling it all the way down to the bottom right, and I'm making sure that this stem has a bit of a curve to it. I don't want it to be stick straight. I want it to look like it has movement, so I'm pulling it all the way down to the bottom right. Now for this right stem, I have 4 leaves, so one coming off the left side, one at the very bottom, and then 2 more up the right side. The process will be the exact same as what we've done so far, so I'm going to speed up through this process, but be sure to take your time, and then we'll go back in and add the berries and the ribbon. Alrighty, so we have all of our leaves in place. If you get to this point and you decide it looks a little too bare in a certain area, or maybe it looks a little off balance, like you have too many leaves on one side and not enough on the other, you can always go back in and add more. This is just kind of that first step of laying out where you want the stems to be and the general shape of your composition. So I'm liking how this is looking, and the next thing I want to do is add in our little red berries. And I'm aware that most mistletoe plants have white berries, but I really like the look of the red ones, and I want the red berries to match our little red ribbon up top. So that's the color I'm going to use, but feel free to use whatever color berry you want. So let's get started on the berries. You can add, again, as many as you want, as little as you want. If you don't want any berries, that's fine too. I'm just placing the majority of them in these areas in between the leaves, and each little stem will have anywhere between 2 and 4 little berries. So let me bring you in a bit closer so you can see the process. So let's start with these 2 little berries at the top left. I'm going to be using permanent alizarin crimson. That's one of my favorite festive pinkish red colors. And the key here is you really want all of your berries to look different. Just like we had some different shaped leaves and we have different values, we want the same thing for our berries. We don't want them to all look identical, especially because they are the same shape, they're round. But I want some of them to be a bit lighter, some darker. I'm going to add a little bit of shading on some of them, but not all of them. So just make sure that you're not making everything too uniform. But I'm going to start with a thin base layer of a light value of this mixture. I have a little bit too much water on my brush, so I'm going to tap that off. But as I paint in this base layer, I'm going to leave a little bit of white space for the highlight on the berry. It's going to be kind of hard to tell here, but just a little sliver of white. And that's going to be where the light is hitting our berry. While it's still wet, I'm going in with a darker value. Again, you can see that color bleeding and blending just like it was with the leaves. And I'm gently outlining the shape of that berry. Same thing, rinsing off my brush and going to help smooth that out a little bit because that edge from the dark red to the light red is a little bit too harsh. So I'm making it have a soft gradient. And you can see that highlight there. That is where the light is hitting this berry. And then around the edges is where the shadows are. I don't like to go too crazy with realism and making sure everything looks perfect in terms of shadows and highlights, but I do just like to add a little bit of that. So I'm making sure the edges are nice and dark and that highlight remains very bright. And there's our first berry. Let's do a lighter one next to it. So once again, starting with a super light value, I'm applying that base layer, and then I'll go in and layer on top of it. And apologies, my camera battery died while I was painting that second one, but you can see there's a slight difference. We have a darker berry here with a bit of a stronger highlight, slightly lighter one here. So that's what I'm talking about. You just want to make sure there's some variation in all of your elements so that nothing looks too flat or too uniform. So let's go ahead and add a few more in real time, and then you can paint at your own pace. I am going to add all these berries first and then connect them with the stems. So as of now, they're just kind of floating there, but we will connect them. I'm going to paint another one here. And for these darker ones, I'm not going to worry too much about adding them in layers because I know it's going to be pretty dark, but as long as I have that highlight there, it still keeps it from looking too flat. I'm going to go back to layering. So I'm going to start with a light layer. I'm still going to leave a spot for a highlight on the very right side, but I'm starting with the light layer of my red, and then kind of similar to what we did with the leaves, going back in with additional layers that are quite a bit darker to add in the shadows and utilize that wet on wet blending technique. Again, maintaining the highlight there, which is the lightest value, and then having the darkest values around the outer edges where the berry is curving around. So that's where it's going to be the darkest. You're going to have a lot of shadows there. So making sure I tap in the darkest value around the edge and maintain that nice light area. So I'm going to speed this next part up, again, same process. I'm just going to be adding in some berries here and there, filling up some of those empty spaces, but not going too crazy because I do want this to still be a very clean and elegant piece. So I don't want it to be overrun with berries. I just want them to be a nice little pop of color throughout the leaves. Okay, leaves and berries are done. You can see the berries have some great variation there. So there's some that are really light, we have some that are really dark, and then some of them also have that gradient from light to dark with some more intricate shading. And so now we're going to connect all the berries, and we'll use the same color we did for the leaf stems. And in doing this, we can also make sure that all of our stems are roughly the same green color. So like we mentioned earlier, we have some stems that are a little darker than the initial layer we first put down, which was very light value. So I want to grab a medium value that can kind of bridge that gap between some of the lighter and darker ones. And I'll start by just gently connecting these berries. I want them to have a bit of a curve so it looks like they're just kind of hanging off of these leaf stems. So taking the tip of my brush, bringing that up to meet the stem. Again, that one's quite a bit darker than that initial stem. So we will be making sure that those all look the same, or roughly the same. And we'll continue just adding these little stems. Just like that. So now everything is connected and I can go back through and make sure all the stems are roughly the same color. So I'm just going over with that medium value of green. And I'm going to make sure the entire stem looks nice and cohesive all the way up to the top. So I'm just going over it with the second layer, making sure that medium green value is the same all the way through. All right, so everything is looking great. Now we can go ahead and add the ribbon. I'm going to be using very similar techniques. I don't want my ribbon to look hyper realistic. I don't want it to look flat. So I'll just be starting with a light value, similar to what we did with the leaves and the berries, and then adding in some of the darker value. I'm using the same exact permanent alizarin crimson that I did for the berries, but you can use any color you want for this ribbon. I'm going to work section by section for this ribbon. So we have the two loops up at the top, and then we have the two little parts that are hanging down. So starting with the left side, I'm going to place a base layer, very light value of my red mixture. I'm going to make it just a little bit darker. And you can see it's coming off to the side. And then all of the sections of this ribbon or bow will meet right here where the stems intersect. And then that's where the center of the bow is tied to. But for now, starting with this light value and then grabbing my darker value of alizarin crimson. Again, I'm not worried too much about making sure all the shadows are in the perfect spot or making it look hyper realistic, but I want a little bit of contrast between light and dark. So I'm going to add that darker value at the bottom and then kind of line that bottom edge. Take my brush, smooth it out. And this is the process I do for a lot of my paintings. It doesn't really matter what, if it's a leaf, a berry, a ribbon. I always like to generate these really beautiful soft blends or gradients. So that's what I like to do. There are lots of different ways to paint and lots of different watercolor techniques, but this is generally what I like to do. And I'll smooth it out by rinsing off my brush, tapping it on my paper towel, and then just cleaning up some of those edges, making sure I don't have any harsh lines. So I'll go back in, and I pulled some of the alizarin crimson straight from my palette, so it's very dark for this section. Gently lining the bottom and smoothing it out. And now we can do the top left little loop part of the bow. So once again, starting with that light value, and I'm applying some pressure to make the outer edge of it a little bit thicker, and then bringing it down to that center point. So again, this is where all the parts of this bow are coming together. That's also where all the stems of this mistletoe are coming together. So starting with the light value, grabbing some dark alizarin crimson, tapping in some shadow along the inner edge, and here where they all intersect. Again, not being too crazy about making it look super realistic or worrying too much about where I'm putting these shadows. Just making sure I have a bit of contrast to make this little bow pop. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to have this right side of the ribbon hanging down a little bit further. Again, don't want it to look too symmetrical. So I'm going to pull this one down a bit further, but it'll be the same technique, so feel free to do it at your own pace. And there we go. I hope you enjoyed painting this mistletoe along with me today. I do have a couple more holiday and winter themed tutorials planned, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on those ones. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next video.